American father and a Korean mother, and I grew up here. I went to international schools in Kyoto and in Osaka until I was 19. And then when I graduated, I went to a college called Antioch College in the States, which was in Ohio. And during that time, that was when the US-UK-led invasion of Iraq began. And although I was a creative writing major, I became really involved in student activism during that time, and I decided to switch my major to journalism and peace studies. Then, after I graduated from college, I came back to Japan and I was teaching English in various places. When I heard about the Peace Boat, have any of you heard of the Peace Boat? Okay. Most of you are from abroad, I guess, right? This might be something that you'd be really interested in looking into. It's a Japanese NGO that's based in Tokyo, and it's called Peace Boat because it's an actual ship that travels all the way around the world and stops in different ports as a kind of educational initiative. And so they visit different groups and activists in different parts of the world to educate mostly Japanese passengers on issues like the environment and peace and social justice and all kinds of stuff. So when I went on the Peace Boat, I applied as a writer. You can be a writer for the Peace Boat. And we traveled for 101 days around an equatorial route, stopped in 16 ports. So really cool organization if you're interested in travel and this kind of stuff. Then after I got back from that voyage, I decided to go to grad school. And some of you are in Paul Scott's class? Yeah? Okay. So Paul Scott was kind of monumental in convincing me to go to grad school. And I have a lot of respect for your teacher. So I went to SIT, which is in Vermont, and I got my MA in conflict transformation. And then after working with Johan Galton, who is another friend and mentor of Paul Scott in Austria, I came back to Japan, and I started teaching. I was teaching English again because that's what you do as a foreigner in Japan. And I was actually an English trainer in a company when the March 11th catastrophe happened. And I decided that if I was going to stay in Japan, I needed to do something that was closer to my field at that time. And so I started work as a campaigner for an organization called Avaz. Have any of you heard of Avaz before? So I was a Japan campaigner for Avaz. And then I started working on Peace Mask Project. So this is my current kind of passion. And I would like to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. But before we go into kind of our work, I wanted to start by exploring definitions of peace and also violence, because I want you to understand where I'm coming from when I look at peace and violence before I explain the work that I do. Okay? So what is peace? We think of world peace and peace between countries, peace between people, peace within yourself. How would you define it? Anybody have a definition for peace? Yeah? 戦闘のない。Oh, 戦争のない。A period without war. Okay. Anybody else?
Just the absence of conflict.
The absence of conflict.
The presence of unconditional acceptance.
The presence of unconditional acceptance. Yeah. There's all kinds of different definitions of peace. And, you know, for example, another question would be, how do you know when you have peace? And how do you know when you've lost it? Or where is the line that you draw that says, this is when we have peace and this is when we don't? Where is that line? So some of you mentioned the absence of conflict, right? The absence of conflict is a common, the absence of war and the absence of conflict are kind of the common definitions of peace. But I think it can go deeper than that. So what I think is that the opposite of peace is not war, but it's violence. So then I want to look at what violence is. Can anybody give me kind of a definition for violence?
Actions intended to harm.
Actions intended to harm. Anybody else? Sorry? Aggression towards other people.
Rooted from hatred.
Okay, yeah.
Rooted from hatred.
Rooted from hatred. Anybody else? Okay, so the definition that I use in thinking about violence is that violence is anything that prevents a person or group from reaching their full potential. So if you think about that for a second, full potential, actually Reggie and I talked a little bit about this, and depending on a cultural context, this might mean different things. But if you think of your dreams in life, kind of your full potential in terms of your dreams, what you want to achieve, your health, your goals, your lifestyle. And then you think of a moment in your life when someone or a group or an institution prevented you in some way from reaching that potential. That to me is what I consider violence. So if you look back at your whole life and you can't think of an instance when somebody prevented you from reaching your potential, then you may be one of the few very lucky people that has had a lifetime of peace. But this is quite rare. If we have trouble thinking about it, we can think of, let's say, a child in a war zone somewhere in the world, and this child maybe doesn't have access to education or proper nutrition. In so many ways is frustrated in terms of reaching their potential, experiences all kinds of violence in their life. They didn't choose to start this war or to participate in it, and yet they experience violence in their life all the time. So again, while many people think the opposite of peace is war, I think that it's more than that, that it's violence. So then let's go a little bit further into thinking about violence. I like to think of violence as an iceberg. So, as you all know, what's above the surface is much smaller compared to what's beneath the surface. This is coming from peace and conflict theory, and if any of you have studied peace and conflict theory, you'll know the name Johan Galton. Johan Galton came up with the term structural violence, and this is what he was talking about. So, when I say that in most people's minds the opposite of peace is war, that's talking about direct violence, which is above the surface. It's what we can see. That's killing and shooting and shouting and stabbing and all these forms of violence that are really easy to identify. Is known as direct violence. But what's below the surface are other forms of violence. One is structural violence. So structural violence is the institutionalization of violence. And this happens in policies, this happens in education, this happens in military structures or government structures. The institutionalization of things like classism, sexism, racism, all these other kind of massive forms of violence that are perpetrated on entire societies. And then deeper than that is what's known as cultural violence. So this is kind of our beliefs, our belief systems, our worldviews, the stories that we tell our children, the dehumanization of an other during war or at other times, us versus them thinking. This is all forms of cultural violence. It's the kind of really deep stuff that's really hard to see and hard to uproot because it's so ingrained in who you are, in your identity, or in a society's identity. So, again, if you take away the direct violence, like in a war, you take away the direct violence, then you might have something like a ceasefire. The two sides stop firing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's peace, because if you don't address structural and cultural roots of violence, it's just going to keep re-emerging, right? It's going to come up again and again and again. So this is why we need to look deeper. And great leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. You all know Martin Luther King Jr. He really believed that peace was a process, and that it required at least a philosophical, if not a spiritual, commitment to the values of peace. And that was the only way that it was going to be sustainable, that peace would be lasting. And he said, peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we reach that goal. Gandhi also similarly said, be the change that you want to see in the world, which is becoming cliche, but I don't necessarily think people really understand what that means yet. Be the change that you want to see in the world. That's kind of talking to me about uprooting cultural forms of violence, or addressing cultural forms of violence. Okay, so that's all I want to say about peace and violence. That gives you an idea of where we're coming from. So any peace-building effort now has to address cultural roots and structural roots. And that's the kind of work that we're trying to do. Before I continue, does anybody have any questions or comments? You're like, no. Any comments, questions? No? Really? Nothing to say about these things? It doesn't interest you, or it doesn't like remind you of anything from your home countries, or anything you want to address? Okay.
I'm not particularly sure I agree with that definition of violence.
Okay.
I feel like it's a little bit too broad. I feel like there are, aspects that are potentially out of really anyone's control. Any kind of person who would potentially be a perpetrator of violence.
Mm-hmm.
That can hold people back from reaching these people.
Can you say it again?
I feel like there are things that are out of the control of any perpetrator. That they're just
Out of the control. It doesn't include.
like out of anybody's control.
Yeah.
That would restrict someone from
Reaching their potential. So then if we added something like violence is an act of aggression committed by a perpetrator.
maybe
That prevents-
violence is a deliberate act that prevents a person
Okay.
or group from reaching the goal.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I have to think about that a bit, but yeah.
Would the non-deliberate act be the cultural, the cultural level of it? Or would the non-deliberate act not be as evil? Like if you were to consider an act that prevented somebody from getting to their full potential as a non-deliberate one, with the same effect, if it were deliberate or not,
But whether it's deliberate or not, I think it's an action, and whereas this has it's anything. I think that's a little bit too broad.
see some direction. Like there has to be someone who is being inflicted with violence, kind of. But I also agree with both of you that, you know, it's kind of, you can't, the distinction between conscious and unconscious acts of violence is kind of what we're talking about. Because cultural roots of violence are not necessarily conscious. That's a really important point for both of you to make.
The action has to come from somewhere within the culture of the individual.
Yeah.
So it has to be an action. I think that's
Mm-hmm. So violence is an act.
Yes.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Yes.
This is semi-related, but are you saying that to prioritize addressing cultural violence over like peace building within existing systems, so like addressing direct violence?
No, I'm not. So but this is really important. And if we had more time, what I would love to share with you is the fact that there are terms for different levels of peace building. So for example, if you think of the term ceasefire, conflict resolution, it's more direct violence oriented. It's like you need immediate stop to the killing, and that's really important work. And according to an academic or a philosopher called Lederach, Jean-Paul Lederach, he used the term peace building. He's actually the first one that came up with that term as a singular word. And he was talking about doing the longer term work at structural and cultural levels. And that's kind of peace building. And Johan Galton called it positive peace, whereas addressing direct violence is negative peace. Both are important. It's not that one's better than the other, but it's different types of work. And for any lasting peace, you have to include cultural violence and structural violence, or addressing these things. Really, really good question. Yes?
The way I'm actually understanding this, if hypothetically you manage to eliminate the cultural violence, I think the structural violence actually kind of depends on that, so it would kind of diminish, and I think the direct violence would disqualify.
Probably, but I mean, that would be the goal.
That would be the goal.
At the same time, like, another thing that is controversial is the term post-conflict. You know, you hear this word in like development work, for example, it's like post-conflict Rwanda. But a lot in peace building, we don't like that term because you don't ever get rid of conflict. It's just that we, as society or as a person, we haven't been given the tools on how to deal with conflict. So you always have conflict. Conflict is natural. But having like post-conflict, so like eliminating violence is another thing that's probably not possible, right? Okay, I'm gonna move on because I'm always like talking too long and not keeping track of time and cutting into Reggie's. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Okay. So the project, Peace Mask Project, it was started by a Korean artist named Young Hee Kim, who is also my mother. And in the year 2000, she turned 50 years old, and she had spent 25 years in Japan, where she's still living now, and 25 years in Korea, where she was born. So half and half, and she felt like she wanted to commemorate this kind of milestone, not only for herself, but historically, because as you all know, there's a lot of conflict, historic conflict between these two countries. So she wanted to kind of celebrate. And she started to make these masks of Japanese and Korean individuals, her friends, basically. This mask is made from washi. It's a traditional paper that's used in all over Asia. The process of making the mask is that the model kind of lies on a table, and there's a plaster that's applied to their face. And in order for them to breathe, they just have 2 straws in their nose. And then they apply this plaster, and as you apply the plaster, it becomes really heavy and really dark. So it's kind of a frightening experience. It's almost like being buried. And some people can't stand it. They just kind of like, they have to take the plaster off right away. But what we realized was that this experience was really powerful for a lot of people because they had to trust the artist completely. And to be in that darkness and kind of restricted in their breathing for 20 minutes without being able to open their eyes, without being able to speak. So this became a kind of theme, which was to build trust through art. And she started to make, like I said, Japanese and Korean individual spaces. They were all coming to the project out of this shared value to celebrate this friendship between Japan and Korea. And she had tons of volunteers that just kind of popped up and started to help her with this project. So it just kept growing and kept growing and kept growing. And eventually, after 2 years, they had made 1,580 masks, or 1,580 individual masks. This is a final exhibition in Yokohama. They also had a final exhibition in Seoul. And each one of those little bumps is a mask, and everyone is unique. So the message kind of that this project is sending out as an art exhibition is that when you look up close at these masks, you see that each one is totally individual. That we have such a diversity of features, and it's incredible. But at the same time, you can't tell the nationality. You often can't tell the gender. You can't tell the age. So what we're trying to express through this, and it's just this very simple washi, we don't paint it, we don't color it, we don't do anything with it, it's just very simple. And what we're trying to do with this is to express the fact that beneath all of these different identities, beneath all of these different diversities, we're all human, and we share a common humanity. And this is the message that this Peace Mask project is sharing. So after that initial project between Japan and Korea, we've held Peace Mask projects in Finland, and Spain, and the United States, India, Cambodia, and have made up to 2,000 peace masks so far. Each peace mask model, the process is quite long, it takes like 3 or 4 hours. And they share a peace message, which is kind of like their contemplation on peace, which travels with this exhibition. And so in the past 14 years as we've done this project, what we've seen is that it's not just the art that's speaking to people, but the fact that people spend hours together in this kind of communal setting, that Peace Mask project can actually become a platform or a vehicle for dialogue, which is really important in this work. You get people from different sides of historic conflicts coming together to talk for the first time about peace, about their fears, about their pasts, about their beliefs. And this is really important. So, last summer we started our current project, which is Peace Mask East Asia. And we're working with youth from Japan, China, and Korea. And our goal is to make 999 masks, 333 from each of the 3 countries. And our big dream, which we're working on right now, is to exhibit these masks at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris to kind of commemorate the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. We're a small group of international group of people from all over the world. We meet in Kyoto once a month. If you're interested in coming to one of our meetings, I'm very happy to welcome you. It usually happens in my house. We just kind of gather on the weekend and have tea and talk about things and plan for the future. So if you have any interest in joining us, you're more than welcome. If you are a youth from Japan, China, or Korea, or you have friends who would like to be a model, that's also possible. Please get in touch with me, which you can do by going to the website or sending me an email at peacemaskproject@gmail.com or keeping in touch with us on Facebook at Peace Mask Project. board meetings. So
Okay.
it's core team members, but we often have people who are just interested in the project coming and joining us. But it's similar in the sense that we're from different countries. Anybody else?
Where are you getting funding?
That's a big question for us too. Yeah, it's an ongoing problem. We're registered as an NPO in Japan, and we have in the past gotten funding from different foundations, cultural foundations, and institutions, and also we don't want to go for government funding just because of the sensitivity. We're trying not to be politically leaning in any sense. So we're avoiding government funding, and right now we're mostly based on individual donations. This is always a question on our minds.